And without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Attorney Rex Anderson. He is a practicing attorney in Genesee County. He's been an attorney since 1991. He's a principal of Rex Anderson PC, Davison, Michigan, and he's practicing exclusively in consumer bankruptcy, and then the Federal Debt Collection Act, and injury litigation. He is a member of the Michigan Consumer Law Section, National Association of Consumer Bankruptcy Attorneys, National Association of Consumer Advocates, and the Michigan Association for Justice. I would like you all to welcome Attorney Anderson.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As Deborah has just indicated, the area of specialty of my practice is in consumer law, and I've kind of developed a bit of a niche with law that deals with consumer debts. We handle bankruptcies, and the other aspect of our practice is suing debt collectors. There's a federal law that was enacted back in 1978, and it was a law that was meant to govern the conduct of debt collectors. Up until that point, debt collectors had not been regulated, had not been a regulated industry. And there's all kinds of horror stories of a lot of abusive and oppressive tactics that debt collectors were using on consumers. So Congress took it upon themselves to have studies and to have hearings and to take testimony to really find out what was going on. And after they did all these studies and they had these witnesses show up and talk about, what was really going on in the collection industry, they determined that we needed to have a law that would regulate the debt collection industry. Because, plain and simple, there were just too many abuses that were happening. And these abuses were actually increasing the rate of divorce. They were increasing the number of bankruptcy filings. They were causing people to lose their jobs because of the calls that were being made to people's employers. And so the Congress passed the law. President Jimmy Carter signed that law into effect, and now we have a federal law that governs the conduct of debt collectors. I have a slide presentation here. Why don't we just go to the next slide, and then the slide after that. All right, we can go to that slide there. So, it doesn't matter whether you owe a debt or not, okay? The law requires the debt collector to comply with the law. And down to its basic essence, the Fair Debt Collection Act requires debt collectors to treat the consumer with respect, dignity, fairness, and truth. Okay? Those are, the fundamentals, okay? The fundamental requirements that a debt collector is held to. And any time a debt collector is not treating a consumer with respect, with dignity, fairness, or they're not being truthful, they've in all likelihood violated this federal consumer law that's meant to protect you, me, or anyone else who owes a debt. So the fact that you or anyone, a person owes a debt has no bearing on whether or not that debt collection agency should comply with the law. And I think a lot of people think, well, just because I owe a debt, I'm a bad person, there's something illegal about that, and I don't have any rights because I owe this debt. That's just not the case, okay? You have a right to be treated with respect, dignity, fairness, and truth. Any collector has those rights. I mean, any consumer has those rights. So, the other aspect to this law is that you don't need to have money to hire a lawyer to protect yourself or to enforce this consumer law. Congress knew that they did not have the funds or the resources to go out and regulate every collection agency out there. So they had a provision that entices lawyers to represent consumers that are being abused or harassed or oppressed by debt collectors. They put a provision in the law that allows the attorney fees to be paid if the case is a successful case against the collector. That is, that the collector is proved to be non-compliant with the law, that the debt collectors proved that they violated the law. Now, I think a lot of debt collection agencies are doing their jobs right, and debt collection agencies have a right to collect debts. Okay. The only point that I take issue with is when they violate this federal law. So you can go to the next screen. This law, as I mentioned, regulates the debt collection agents, the agencies, the individual collectors, and the large corporate collectors. Some of these debt collectors, they employ thousands of employees. They have call centers which house thousands of collectors that sit at little cubicles and chairs in front of a monitor, and there's an automatic dialer in the background. We call it a robo-dialer that's just blistering these calls out there. And as soon as a consumer answers the phone, that call gets rerouted to a collector who sits there at a screen and sees everything, all the personal information about that particular consumer. And there'll be a history of all the contacts that the collection agency has made with that consumer. So if you know of anyone that's had multiple calls in a single day, a lot of times those calls are being made by a robo-dialer, a predictive dialer, an automated dialer that's basically just a computer hooked up to a phone system, and it causes these calls to go out for the collector, so they're not sitting there punching in the numbers for every single call. Getting back to the actual statute, the violations are costly to the debt collectors. If the consumer goes out and does a Google search and types in collection harassment, there's so much information out there. The consumer is now learning that there is a law that protects them, and whereas years and years ago, a lot of times they didn't think that they had rights, they're now finding out that they do. And if they get enough information to where they know at least enough to go out and talk to a lawyer that specializes in collection harassment cases, that's the first step. And of course, once they've found a lawyer that does specialize in these cases, it goes typically, if the violation is a legitimate violation, it goes bad for the collector, because this is a strict liability statute, okay? The collector is either compliant with the law or they're violating the law. And if they are found to have violated the law, they have to pay to the consumer all of the consumer's actual damages. They also have to pay what's called statutory damages. Statutory damages are basically a monetary amount of money up to $1,000 that's meant to punish the collector who got caught violating the law. So you don't even have to have actual damages in order to prosecute a claim against a violating collector. You simply have to have proof that they violated the statute. What is proof of a debt collector violating the statute? Well, that would be your word against the debt collector's word. And there's a number of different violations that can occur, and we'll get into those a little further down. But the most common ones are, obviously a collector is not going to be able to use profanity in the course of their collecting against you. They're not allowed to call third parties and inform third parties that a person owes a debt. That's something that happens frequently. Debt collectors use that tactic to put pressure on the consumer, because what could be worse than to have your neighbor finding out, that a person owes a debt? I mean, I've seen it all, and it's interesting. I've had clients come in with handwritten notes, from the next door neighbor saying, this law office wants you to call them right now, and they said it's really important. And it's obvious that it's a collector that's called upon the neighbor, put upon the neighbor to go and, let the consumer know, we know where you are. We know where you're located. We know your neighbors, and this is going to continue until you pay us money. It's almost like those experiments, the Pilgrim experiments that happened out in California back in the 60s, where they did the experiments. They had instructors that were telling the student to administer an electrical shock to somebody that was in a cubicle, a plastic cubicle where everyone could see, and the instructor kept telling the student, turn up the volume, turn up the volume. And meanwhile, this person with the electrodes all attached to him is screaming and shaking and, writhing in pain. But the results of the experiment were basically that people will do what they're told to do. And that really kind of goes back to that whole era of, in Germany during the Nazi regime. People would, they would just follow orders. And similarly, in the collection industry, if you have a manager saying, turn up the volume, man, we got to get that money, show me the money. How else are you going to get people to show you the money but by turning up the volume? And one way that they turn up the volume is informing the neighbors about the debt. and embarrassing the consumer and shaming the consumer into paying a debt. I think that people want to pay their debts. I talk to a lot of people that have debt-related difficulties. I have yet to run into somebody that intentionally wants to scam their way out of paying a legitimate debt. However, we live in the state of Michigan. You know, we have employment problems, we have income problems, we have heads of households that have suffered medical catastrophes. You know, when it comes down to putting food on your table or paying a debt collector, I think the choice is obvious, okay? Sorry, Mr. Debt Collector, but we want to keep the electric on, we want to keep food on the table, we need to keep clothes on our back. And so that's, you know, those are some of the situations where, you know, you're going to run into collectors trying to figure out other ways to get money. I mean, even in the collection handbooks that I've seen through the litigation that I've done, there's sections on how to get money out of people that are on assistance, state assistance. I mean, there's a whole chapter devoted to those folks. And, you know, I mean, for a collector, most of the time it's all about show me the money. You can go to the next screen. Very important to know that in order to prosecute a claim under this statute, you have to be a consumer. And a consumer is simply somebody who makes purchases for personal, family, or household purposes. That could include, that could even include gambling. That would even be included under that debt, or that definition. I've had cases where that was considered entertainment purposes. I'm not suggesting that anybody go out to Las Vegas and rack up a debt, but that's an example of what could be considered personal, family, or household purposes. You also have to have a debt collector, and there's a distinction that we all need to make between a debt collector and the original creditor, who, you know, is the store or the credit card that the debt obligation was made on. A debt collector is a third-party business that collects the debts of another. That's what they're in the business for. They're all set up just to collect other people's debts. So an example of a creditor would be like J.C. Penney's, Sears, you know, Exxon gas station. Those would be examples of creditors that do not fall under the Fair Debt Collection Practice Act. Those creditors are pretty much able to, they get away with pretty much everything when they collect their own debts. It's very difficult to go after a creditor. There's not real strong state law that allows us to go after creditors, but there is this good federal law that allows you to go after the collector. It's a very good law for the consumers. And eventually, those creditors, if they don't get the money themselves, they're going to turn their debt over to a debt collector. So it's just a matter of time before it goes to a third-party debt collector. And of course, the consumer has to be a human being. You can't have a business that can sue under the Fair Debt Collection Practice Act. If the debt is business related, it doesn't qualify. It has to be household, family, or personal. Did you have a question?
No, I moved into my house back 10 years ago, and for about 2 years, I was harassed for the person that used to live there.
Right.
Could I have sued?
There's a provision in this code, this law, that other people, quote unquote, are also protected from harassment, oppression, or abuse by a debt collector.
Can you go back 10 years and get them?
No, that's a very good question though. How far can you go back? How long can you go back to sue on a violation by a debt collector? And the answer to that question is 1 year.
Oh.
There's a 1 year statute of limitations on any act that would be a violation of this law. So, go ahead.
Do some people have multiple debt collectors? Because I have an issue where they keep calling my phone number for a different person, and our phone numbers differ by one number. And I get calls and I keep saying, you know, this is that person's number, take my number out of your database.
Right.
And I've done that about 6 times. So are there multiple debt collectors on people?
Oh, sure there are. In fact, you know, typically, you know, if a person owes one debt, it's very, very possible and almost to be expected that they may owe other debts as
Well, then how do I get them away from calling me?
Well, first of all, you identify who the collector is. Do you know who the collector is?
I asked in a couple of instances.
Have they told you?
Yeah, I think so.
Who'd they say?
I don't remember.
Okay. Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to document who's calling you. You want to take down a telephone number if it's showing up on your caller ID. It's so easy to find out who's calling you because you'll take that number and you type it right into Google, and up pops, a reporter might be 800 notes. You'll find out who's calling you because you'll see a long list of people just like us that are, they're writing, notes about their experiences with the same entity or the same bill collector that's calling them that's using that same number. So that's one way to identify if you have a bill collector calling you.
Then you call him.
Yeah, but then after that, who do you report them to?
Well, then you need to talk to an FDCPA lawyer, and then you can Google FDCPA lawyers and find a lawyer that specializes in those cases, and they'll make sure those calls stop, and they'll give you compensation.
Or I suppose I could change my phone number.
Well, but, that's a big deal. Change your number, then you have all those people you have to tell
That's
about your new number, and this is exactly why this law was formed.
However, I'm going to have to pay the lawyer to take care of the fact that.
No, this is what I was
Oh,
saying.
I say you're saying that's documentation.
Right. There's absolutely no paying a lawyer by the consumer. The
Okay.
debt collector has to pay the lawyer when they're found
Okay.
to have violated the law.
But how do they know they're violating the law if they have a phone number for a particular person and that is not their correct phone number? It's somebody like my phone number. So the debt collector does not really know he's violated the law.
Well, that's where you come in, and you call them up, and you make a record of calling the debt collection agency and saying, look, you have the wrong telephone number. Stop calling me. Or better yet, find out who it is that's calling you, and also put it in writing. Your case, if they continue to call you and they ignore what you're telling them, then it's a big problem for them, and the case value goes way up. When they ignore you and you say, look, I'm innocent, I don't owe this debt,
I'm
stop
not this
calling
person.
me. Right, stop calling me. And if a collector is stupid enough not to get their database straightened out, that's a good case. I like
Right.
those cases.
Something like that keep happening me, they keep calling, and I tell them, so I answer the phone, and say, are you this person? This is the roll call, and I'll say no, and then we'll hang up. Or I'll say yes, and then they'll get on the phone, so I'm not this person. And then they say, well, we can't discuss it with you because you're not this person. So I don't like what you have the wrong number, but they don't care. But I'm constantly telling you, I'm not this person, and so we can't discuss with you what you're looking for because you're not this person. But we keep calling every day. And how many times are they calling one day?
Okay, great question.
Well,
Did everyone hear the question? She's saying that she's getting a call from a bill collector using that robo-dialer, okay? She picks up the phone, the automated artificial voice says, you know, are you Jane Smith? And she says no. But she can't get through to a live person, or if she does get through to a live person, they say, oh, well, you're not the debtor, we can't talk to you. Oh my God, man, I mean, what a catch-22. I mean, it's just a vicious cycle. So she's caught in this vicious circle and she can't get out. So that's when you call a lawyer. You call the lawyer. I mean, anytime you have a question, I always tell all my clients, feel free to give me a call. I would rather tell you, take a moment, you know, talk to you, you know, tell you what the law is, and it's just so much easier for me later on when you guys, or when somebody comes to me and they really have a mess. I mean, I'd much rather say, look, you know, don't do that or do this, get the information, get the telephone number, you know, take a digital picture of the caller ID. What better proof is that, you know?
You can do *69 and have it cost you $1.75, but it's on your phone bill.
Right, or you can just get your phone records. And that leads me to something else that a lot of folks aren't aware of, but this happens a lot, where debt collectors, they do what's called skip tracing. And that's where they go out and they, on the internet, they're finding all this information out about the consumer. They have that Google Maps where you can, you know, beam right in on the consumer's front door. You can see if there's a car parked in the driveway. And a lot of times they'll use that information to intimidate consumers, to make them think, I'm right around the corner and I'm going to come over there if you don't write me an electronic check right directly out of your bank account right now. It's very unnerving when someone's personal information, all of a sudden, you know, they're talking to a stranger that has that very personal information. So it scares them, and debt collectors are not allowed to, you know, intimidate people in that way to make them pay a debt. You know, they can call and they can say, look, you owe this debt. Would you please pay this debt? You know, we're going to keep calling you until you pay this debt. Now, what every consumer should know is that if they really want the calls to stop, all they have to do is put a request, a cease and desist request in writing. You just say, dear collector, please stop calling me. I'm not paying this debt. If you do that and you send it out and you keep proof of the letter, okay, make a photocopy of it, make a photocopy of the envelope with the stamp, properly addressed to the debt collector with a good return address, make a photocopy. It's better to mail it certified, but hey, you know, if you've got a photocopy of the envelope, mailbox rule. Debt collectors use that rule against consumers all the time, so, you know, the consumer can do the same thing back. So that will require that the debt collector, they can make one other call to you after you put that cease and desist request in writing. So if you know who it is that's calling you, write them this letter, keep proof of it. If they continue to call you after you send that cease and desist letter out, automatic violation. basically an automatic $1,000 in your pocket.
My fax machine records call ID, and it can print out record everything when it can.
Right.
But how many times can they call in one day? Cause they call, wake up to wake, to like the same number over and over or something.
Right. Right. Well, you know, there's a lot of cases coming down on how many calls is considered abusive or harassing. The law states that a debt collector may not engage a consumer repeatedly in conversations or cause the phone to ring repeatedly with the intent to harass, annoy, and oppress. So we get into a lot of, you know, legal case analysis. What, you know, how do you prove that the debt collector really intended, you know, to harass somebody by calling them 10 times in a day? Well, if it makes it to a jury, you know, I gotta think that any jury in the right mind is gonna say, look, you know, 1 to 2 times a day is enough. And that's only if, you know, nobody answered the phone. If somebody answered the phone and said, look, I can't afford to pay this debt, please stop calling me, then they shouldn't call back again. Okay? Once a day is enough. So, all right, let's go to the next screen. So I've talked about the actual damages. The actual damages are typically for things like heart attacks, migraine headaches,
There you go.
you know, physical manifestations, heartburn, you know, upset stomach, you know, and there's a lot of folks out there that experience these symptoms from collector harassment. As I indicated before, the statutory damages, that's just paid to the consumer because you acted like a mini attorney general. You went out, you found yourself an FDCPA lawyer, and you said, Mr. Debt Collector, what you did was illegal, and so now you have to pay. And that's the statutory damage. That's the punishment to the debt collector for getting caught. That and the attorney fees. A lot of times the attorney fees is way, way high, especially if a debt collector chooses to lawyer up and fight it. Okay, if the case is a clear-cut case, the best thing that collector can do is settle it. Okay, let's go to the next.
Could he get enough money to pay off his debts?
A lot of times you can't. A lot of times you can't. I mean, I've had cases that have been resolved in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, you know, it just depends on how egregious the debt collector's conduct is. For example, I had a debt collector call a consumer. She was on state assistance, and the collector talked to the 12-year-old daughter and said, you know, your mom's white trash, we're gonna sue you, and we're gonna take your mobile home, and you'll all be out on the street corner next week. Well, you know, that's trauma to a 12-year-old girl. And that's a 6-figure, maybe a 7-figure case.
But it has to be a collection agency. It can't be an individual person. That's not associated with that.
Right. It has, a debt collector is defined as a third party. It could be an individual, but most likely it's an individual working for a collection agency. Okay?
But can it be an individual? Because I know a
It
case.
depends. I mean, it can't be, you know, Joe Schmo, you know, that lives down the block from you.
No, it's a person that was owed the money.
Okay. So, I mean, he's not a debt collector.
No.
He's not in the business
Yeah,
of collecting debts.
Right.
So this
So you can't sue him.
No, you can't.
Oh,
No, not at all. You could sue him, you know, but he's not, you wouldn't sue him under this law. You just sue him for like a breach of contract. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I got a quick question. I've had this happen to me where I don't subscribe to a magazine, but they send me the subscription anyhow.
I've had it happen too.
And I don't pay, you know, I'm not gonna pay it because I didn't order the magazine. And now they're saying they're gonna send it to a collection agency. What alternatives do I have?
You need to dispute that debt.
Okay.
Okay? And I would write him a letter and I would document it and I would keep track of, you know, the date you mailed it out. Again, really, the best proof that you've mailed something out is going to be certified mail. But the second best proof is to photocopy that envelope, photocopy the letter, make sure you put a date on the letter, and hold on to that evidence. That's evidence, okay? And, you know, you by all means should not be paying a debt that you never even incurred. And this is just another example of, you know, some real sleaziness of what's going on out there. And so I think I'd send them a letter, the magazine company a letter, and as soon as it gets to the debt collector stage, I'd send another letter. But really, you know, the best thing you can do is talk to a lawyer that can counsel you individually on every individual case, because all the individual cases, they're a little bit different, and you want to make sure you document things properly.
I
Yes.
bought the Consumer's Report online, not the magazine you get in your house, but the same magazine, but it's online. And you know those things you have to put a dot in to well, this big thing comes down and down and down and down. You're supposed to put a dot at the end or you can't order it. So I found out after the second year that what I dotted was that they can automatically reorder the magazine every year until I call them and tell them to not do it. So they were constantly taking it out of my, you know, my bank account or my plastic. I can't remember how I charged it.
That's what you didn't read it.
Who can read those things?
Oh, I
There are
know.
hundreds
That's
of
called-
lines and it's
that's
little
called
teeny
fine.
square.
These contracts, I mean, even if you could read them, I mean, they're so hard to understand. The judges, their law clerks, and the lawyers can't even figure out.
Look,
I mean, what
and
these,
it's all it is I agree or I disagree at the bottom. You know?
Right.
That's all it is.
so, unusual times, you know, a debt collector can call between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. They are limited
Wow.
in where they can call you. There's a provision of this law that says that debt collectors are not allowed to call you any place where it's an inconvenient or an unusual inconvenient place or time for the consumer, known by the debtor to be an inconvenient place for the consumer. So, I mean, if you have a daycare and, you know, you work 8 to 5 and you're busy taking care of a lot of little kids, you can tell the collector, hey, look, don't call me during, you know, between 8 and 5. Call me after, or I'll call you, you know, after 6 p.m. And if you make an arrangement like that with the debt collector, then follow through on it. Keep your word. If you say, you know, I'm going to call you at 6 p.m., call them back. If you can't afford to pay the debt, then just tell the collector that. Say, I'm sorry, I can't afford to pay this debt. Please stop calling me. And that is something I tell my clients all the time. I mean, if you can't afford to pay, then that's what you tell them. And you don't need to tell them anything else. They'll ask you 100 different questions. They'll want to, you know, they'll give you 100 reasons, you know, how and why and where you can get the money. Borrow it from your neighbor, borrow it from your grandmother, you know, cash in your pension. Pensions are exempt, okay? Pensions, Social Security, that's exempt funds. That debt collector will never ever be able to touch those funds. They can sue you, they can get a judgment against you, but if the only thing you have going into your bank account is Social Security or a pension that's ERISA approved, they can't touch that money. We talked about calling the relatives, the neighbors, the employers. They're not allowed to do that. And if they do that, I know a lot of people get very upset. They do have physical manifestations. They do have anger and frustration and humiliation that gives them a sick stomach or gives them headaches. Okay, let's go to the next page. Next page, yeah. All right. So, I mean, you can tell the debt collector, don't call me again, I'm not dealing with you, I'm not paying this debt. They can only send one more letter, they can call you up one last time just to say, we got your letter, we're not gonna call you anymore. That's it, okay? They can't even ask you to pay anything. They just have to say, we've received your letter, we'll stop calling. Yes?
Can they force you into bankruptcy or those things like Chapter 13? Can
Very
they
good
force
question.
you into that stuff?
Very good question. By sending this letter off, you know, you got to consider, once you send that letter off, it'll stop the calls, or it's supposed to. And if it doesn't stop the calls, it's an automatic violation. Your FDCPA lawyer will sue that out, and he will get you the $1,000 or more in damages if you can show actual damages. But if you tell them not to call you, now they can go to the next level. They can go out, hire a collection lawyer, and they can sue. They can sue you on that debt to get a judgment, after which they will either garnish your pay at work, or they'll garnish your state tax refund, or they can swoop in and garnish your bank accounts. So, something to think about.
I have a debt that is a dispute, and so I was on the phone, I was saying, my kid, and trying to get it corrected with the original creditor. So now I found out they just sold it. And I was like, well, you just take it to court, because once we go to
Right.
court, and I proved that it's not my debt.
Right.
And I was actually saying, well, you just take it to court, so we can go. So now they just sold it. So
You know, you need to grab a card and we can talk about that situation. You know, she says, look, I don't owe this debt, and yet it goes from one collector to another collector to another collector who call her up, and she says, I don't owe this debt, please stop calling me. And she says, just please sue me so we can go get this resolved in a court of law. But they don't sue her, because it's a whole lot easier to robo-dial her and harass her into paying a debt that she doesn't owe, or sell it to another debt collector to give them a chance. Maybe they'll finally break her down and she'll pay the debt off. There's no excuse for that. When she says she doesn't owe the debt, she's disputing the debt. At that point, the collection attempts should stop, and if anything, they sue it out and let the proofs come down as they will, but in a court of law. Many times, the debt collector has no intention of ever suing on a debt. I've had cases where it's been a $30 debt, and they've harassed my client, and they've ended up paying $30,000.
I love it.
Yes. They're not going to sue out on a $30 debt. They're probably not going to sue out on a $300 debt. They're just going to keep calling and calling and calling, and hopefully, they'll wear the person down, the consumer down, into paying something. Let's go to the next slide.
When it says requires collector to disclose their identity, so if I get the same call again and they say, I'm calling for so-and-so, and I say to them, and who is calling, please? As soon as I say that, they have to tell me.
They do. They
Under
have
1692B.
they have to tell
Say
you
that out
what
loud.
their name is. You're entitled to know what the individual collector's name is.
Well, I want to know the company.
You want to know that too. You want to know that too, but you also want to know the name of the person that you're talking to, because you know what? If they violate the law, the individual collector is liable and can be sued as well. Okay, so of course, you know, it's the collection agency that has, you know, they're the ones that are going to have to pay in most cases, because a lot of these debt collectors, believe it or not, are actually being collected upon themselves. You know, they're behind on their child support, everything else, you know, to the point where, you know, they've got collectors calling them.
You know how
I
to
don't
do
know.
it.
All right. Okay, next slide. Okay, these are more of the technical violations, I consider. My specialty is, you know, in going after collectors that actually are abusive and really harassing to the consumer. They're disrespectful, demeaning to the consumer, or they're barraging them with all these calls from the robo-dialer.
Can
Yes,
they
ma'am.
call on a Sunday?
Yes, they can. They can call on Christmas Eve. They can call on Christmas Day. There's no law against that. There's no law against that. But, you know, there's some lawyers out there that will, you know, I mean, there's, you know, when you do get a notice from a debt collector, you have a right to ask them to validate that debt. You have a right to say, what is this all about? Send me the supporting documentation so I know that I actually really owe this debt. And they're required to do that. But the thing is, you have to do it right away. You only have 30 days from when that first letter comes in. And it's called a validation notice. In my experience, I find that people are not in a real hurry to open up correspondence from a debt collection agency. So sometimes that letter will sit there for days and days and days, and sometimes, sometimes it's too late. And then they can say, well, you didn't respond, so the debt, we deem the debt valid. We deem it legitimate. Otherwise, you should have disputed within the first 30 days. Next slide. Obviously, you know, threats of violence, harm, abuse of obscene, profane language, abusive, excessive ringing. Let me just give you an example of, you know, what would be an abusive phone call.
Hey, Charlie Sheen.
You have one on your phone?
I sure do. I sure do. This one's a guy getting collected on by Randy.
What's wrong with you, man? You guys just called. You writing bad checks? You're stealing tools? Are you just a low-life piece of shit or what? Yeah. Midwest liquor? You remember that bad check you wrote?
So you just kind of came up on that.
You don't remember that, huh? Okay, well, forgive me, Midwest liquor. You wrote about the check you wrote to, let's see here. It is my business. You're a piece of shit if you don't pay your bills. You're trying to steal my fucking tools. What do you mean it's not my business? Really? I'm the owner. And I want my shit or my money. One of the two. You got them. Holy shit. I'm calling the men who I sent my tools to. You know what? I think your tools are back. When? What's been going on all I know a year? Let me ask you this question. Did you go at the liquor store? None of your business. That's because you didn't do it, and you didn't send my tools either. You have no credibility, Rusty. Just a thief. And I'm telling you right now, if you recorded my phone call, you attorney? You guys wanted my attorney's name? Yeah, that ain't no goddamn attorney's number. I get a reversal on the number. Ain't no attorney's office. So stop that BSing. What are you doing? What's your attorney gonna do for you? Or me? He's gonna stop me from harassing me. He can't stop shit. I'm calling to collect the debt, and I'm gonna call you till you die till I get my money. Well, I don't think so. Right now, you're pretty young, buddy. One day you're gonna grow up and start paying your bills, and I'm gonna be right there to get my money. Believe that. You was born in '68. I got plenty of time to wait for you to buy a car. Try to get a credit card, which you can't get none of that right now with the credit you got right now. You know what I mean? You should care though. You're a grown man. Is that how you gonna teach your kids to go out and buy stuff and never pay the bills? What happened with ASSTI? You didn't want to check right? All kind of stuff, man. What's going on? You just don't like paying your bills? It is my business. You owe me money. You owe me money. You're wrong. I don't owe you anything. You owe me money, Rex, and I'm gonna get it.
Alright, so there's an example of hundreds of thousands of dollars case. Okay? They're out there, and just this last year there was a $1.5 million case where they used racial epithets, and it was really, it was vulgar. But a jury came back and awarded $1.5 million, and I don't even think that included the attorney fees.
What can they get against Charlie Sheen on TV?
Charlie Sheen's loaded. He's going to be loaded for a long time. Getting all those
Your
royalties.
day for the ultimate purpose to get your money. Well, I don't mind ruining your day. I'll sleep fine tonight.
This is a debt
First of all,
collector.
man, that was pretty ignorant, but I wouldn't expect anything less from you because you are totally ghetto.
And debt collectors across the country have been caught on tape doing their own version of Mr. Me. Tapes provided to 2020 by consumers and their lawyers.
Second of all, man, learn English, get an education. Then you're sitting on your fat derriere all day long.
You're just a loser. You're a loser. That's why you're in collections. Because you owe money you can't pay. Why don't you just go jump in front of a train? Why don't you do that? Get it over with.
Some people can be completely polite and sweet to. Other people, you ram your fist down their throat and you pull the money out from their gullet. But you get the money.
Hey, Greg, you got my breakfast ready? Where's my biscuits and orange marmalade and sausage? Where's my $40,000 that you owe me?
In this call, the debt collector is not only rude, but in violation of federal law, as he threatens to tell others about the consumer's debt.
Oh, I guess I'm going to have to call this other phone number I got. See if your ex-girlfriend can get in contact with you. We'll see if we can't get her riled up enough to get you riled up to get you on the telephone. You make the decision. You want to be a man, or you want to hide behind the telephone like a little bitty mouse?
What do you think of that?
If you think for 1 minute I'm going to defend that, you're terribly wrong. It violates the law in so many ways.
Roseanne Anderson is the general counsel of the Debt Collectors Trade Organization. She says the vast majority of the country's debt collectors follow the law and provide an important public service to the economy, collecting billions of dollars a year owed to American businesses.
There is nothing wrong with being a debt collector. In fact, I applaud that choice as a profession.
Over the years, this is an industry that has had a very big black eye for alleged abuses and ugly practices. What do you say about that?
I say that stereotype is old and outdated.
Yet the most recent report by the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates the industry, found the number of consumer complaints had jumped 14% to a record level.
I need you to stop calling my dog. No, I'm not, because I'm not going to do that.
Among the most frequent complaints, the illegal practice of calling consumers' workplaces to reveal the debt to others.
Do not call me or call me home. You call me 7 times. You have called me 7 times at once. We'll take the proper steps and work out with your employer. I won't call you no more. We'll speak with the payroll department. You have anything else to say? If you do that, you will get me fired. Whatever the case might be, if you're going to say it, we'll do it to you. You're not paying the bill anyway.
There are also thousands of complaints about debt collectors threatening dire consequences, falsely implying consumers have committed a crime.
Because I'll put your ass in jail
another violation of federal law.
Do you want to go to the big house? The what? Big house. That's what they call prison in America. Am I going to be arrested for this? I will. Of course you will.
But the most common complaint involves the kind of thing that left Loida Riptos of Minnesota in tears, trying to collect from someone who does not legally owe the money.
I don't want to pay a debt that is not mine.
Even after she filed a police report about a case of identity theft, debt collectors continued to hound her to pay a $1,200 credit card bill for an account someone else had opened in her name.
You know, they keep on calling me. And
After you filed the police report?
Yeah, after they file a police report, they keep on calling me and try to get that money.
6 other companies had stopped their collection efforts, but not Apex Financial and its collector, Mel Barrero.
I didn't call you to go through this whole ordeal all over again.
What are you? Are you
I am a guy who's going to end your life. That's who I am.
End my life? What, are you going to tell me?
No, ma'am,
You have no right to tell me that you're going to end my
I have every
life.
right to tell you that.
Like, I was just like, you know, scared.
Has any man ever talked to you like that before?
No, never. I mean, no, never. Never.
This building in Tempe, Arizona, is the Apex Financial Calling Center where Barrero worked. We tracked Barrero down here in Phoenix, and he promised to meet us in this parking lot to tell us his side of the story, but he never showed up. On the phone, he said, the abusive phone call was the result of pressure that he was under from Apex to meet his weekly quota of collections.
Persistence breeds resistance. These collectors want to get paid. They're paid on a commission, they're paid on a percentage.
Minnesota lawyer Pete Berry has made a career out of going after debt collectors and now represents Loida Riptos.
She's become a victim and has been re-victimized by a creditor that really has just gone wild.
You've got to be tough sometimes, don't you, to get that money paid?
People should pay their debts, and debt collectors have a right to be persistent. At the same time, there's no justification for abusing a consumer to get a debt paid.
You're the one who's refusing to pay your bill.
In a statement to 2020, Apex Financial said the collector, Barrero, was fired for other reasons, and that the phone call made by Barrero should not cast a shadow upon the hard work and ethical conduct of other Apex debt collectors, all of whom it said, including Barrero, go through a rigorous training program.
A good debt collector, his or her job is to help find a solution.
And for the consumers, they're not really their friends.
They're not their enemies.
They're not?
No. No, absolutely not. A debt collector is not the enemy of the consumer.
But Mike Flanagan says as a debt collector, he viewed himself as the consumer's worst enemy, until one day when he tried to contact a debtor and got her sister on the phone instead.
And the woman says to me, well, why are you calling? I said, that's none of your business. Where is Kim right now? I want to talk to her right now. And the phone got eerily silent for about 3 or 4 seconds. And the woman then told me, Kim's dead. She was in the World Trade Center on September 11th. And, man, that hit me like a ton of bricks.
Kimberly S. Bauer.
Kim was 31-year-old Kimberly Bauer, whose sister confirmed to 2020 the debt collector's call.
From that moment on, my faith was gone.
You lost the drive.
I lost my belief that being a bill collector and training these people to do the things that we were doing was absolutely righteous. I lost the ability to not care about the debtor.
Flanagan says the best thing consumers can do to stop people like him is contact the Federal Trade Commission, get a lawyer, and get the proof on tape.
I am a guy who's going to end your life.
Why don't you just go jump in front of the train?
If someone knocks on your door, jackass, I forget you.
So, obviously, those are some examples of pretty egregious collector harassment. They don't all do that, not by a long shot, but there are some out there that do resort to these tactics, and those, it's patently illegal to do that. Next slide, please. Go ahead, ma'am.
How do they know who your employer is?
Well, we were talking about skip tracing earlier, and it's amazing the resources that collectors have. They're able to go online. They can find out all kinds of information. They can pull your credit reports. And
They
there's
can?
all that information.
Oh, I guess
is
they
out
probably
there.
could, couldn't
Yes,
they?
they sure do. They dig all the time. That's another way that they get you to pay. Yes, ma'am.
When your ID's been stolen, like that one girl, are there lawyers for that too? Or is there?
There sure are, and in fact, Pete Berry's a good friend of mine. He represented her. That does happen where this situation, this lady's situation, she doesn't owe the debt, and it's gone from various collectors that continue to call her and not listen to when she says this isn't my debt. So the law is to protect them as well, people that don't owe the debt as well. People that get caught in the crossfire, okay? There's children that are answering the phone, there's neighbors, there's relatives that are getting all these calls as well, and the law is intended to protect them as well. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I showed up kind of late. I got the same thing wrong when they got up here. I got a bill collector. I took out a mortgage on my house, and you know how you pay your bill that you owe? The mortgage people wrote a check out to them. And just recently, in December, they had put a judgment out against me. What happened, they sent some sheriffs out, and they came and took my car. And then I went and got it back, but I had to go to court and all this. And then they gave me like 14 days to come back again to go back to the judge and try to fight it and prove that it wasn't mine. But I showed the judge that they were paid for and everything. But then the bill collector turned around and he called me the other day, and he made me set up a payment plan with me, you know.
On a debt.
Yeah, he none of my debt. He told the judge he was going to investigate it. And when I got back from down south with my dad's death, he turned around and called me, and I just had went on and made an arrangement with him because I didn't want to come back out take it or nothing. But they could take your house, and they doing everything. Now it's a company called, I think it's management or something.
Sure.
And they really rude and nasty too.
Well, I'd be happy to discuss, your situation with you. I put some cards on the back table there. Okay. They certainly are not allowed to collect a debt that you don't owe. There's so many cases of debt collectors. Lawyers are debt collectors as well. Okay, there's some lawyers that are debt collectors, and they sue people, and the vast majority of these lawsuits are not answered by the consumer or the debtor. One reason a lot of that happens is because people are, they don't want to deal with the situation. They're more like, it's almost like an ostrich that buries its head in the sand. It doesn't want to deal with the whole collection process, the fact that they legitimately owe a debt. However, there's also such a thing called sewer service, and that's where bill collectors that are lawyers file a lawsuit, and you're supposed to serve that lawsuit personally on the defendant, the person that owes the debt. Many, many times those debtors, those people never get served. They never know that they've even been sued and that a judgment's been entered against them, and until they're being garnished, until the money is out of their bank account. This happens amazingly frequently. I see it happen all the time, and that should be criminal.
Yeah.
But it's a web of deceit that gets woven, and it's very hard to go back and figure out exactly what went wrong. You got to go hunt down a process server that falsified and perjured himself on a return of service. So, but
so you saying they have to serve you personally?
Yes, they're required to serve you personally. Hand that lawsuit to you in person, unless there's somebody that's 18 that resides at your home. There are exceptions, but it's not something they can just throw in the mail. Sometimes they'll send it certified. If you sign for a certified card, that's pretty good evidence that that you actually received the lawsuit.
So once they get the judgment, don't they still supposed to serve you notify you of the order before the guardian.
Sure they are.
Does this work here?
Well, why do that? You know, I mean, if you're not even serving people with the actual lawsuit, why serve them with the judgment? You know, they might get their money out of the account, or they might go to the court and say, this is fraudulent. Why give them that opportunity? I mean, if you've gone that
Just like
far,
him, he's gonna pay just to make it stop.
well, he needs to talk to me, because he shouldn't be paying.
Yeah, plus,
He doesn't know.
what I want to say too, it was that happened, I mean, I did that back in 2002. They just came
The
back
very
and
first
said
day
something about it in
that I had it,
2009.
You paid it off in 2002?
And then they came back and I had proof.
Yeah, we
And
just-
then when I
we
gave
should
her the
pay
proof,
them.
he said he was gonna investigate.
Stop
When I come back from down south, he told me at 14 days was up, the judge said he not gonna see, you know. I was like, wow.
Right.
You know, but in the court, the judge already said that it wasn't my, it wasn't, I mean, the paperwork, sure. But he's trying to say it was on account. It wasn't.
Sure, they say all kinds of things. And you know what I call that zombie debt. Zombie debt, it keeps coming back,
Yeah.
you know. Another example of zombie debt is when a person's filed for bankruptcy and they've gotten a discharge of all their debt. Okay, that's a legal, by operational law, that's a legal discharge. They no longer owe that money, and yet that debt gets bought and sold out on the market by debt buyers, and it rears its ugly head. I've had cases where 20 years later, a debt has been sued out, and it had been discharged in bankruptcy 20 years before.
If a debt collector calls and they get nowhere with it, then they could sell that to another?
Yes, they sure can.
And what idiot would buy it if, the first guy can't get the money?
Right. Well, it's a good question, actually, because the first collectors, they're called primary debt collectors, they get those debts, and those are hot paper. That's considered hot paper. So they'll typically have that debt from anywhere from 2 months to 6 months. If they don't collect, if they don't get money or a promise to pay, then it'll go, it goes back to the creditor, American Express or Chase Visa or Capital One, and they'll send it out to a secondary debt collector that'll hold on to that debt. They'll call on it. They'll try to collect on it.
Oh, okay. So it's not really sold to another debt collector.
It certainly can be. I mean, this is $1 billion industry, the debt buying and selling. So there's some corporations out there that's all they're in the business of, paying 5 cents on the dollar. It's a $10,000 credit card. They buy it for $100. You don't have to hit too many home runs, to get your money back and make a profit on it. And I'll say that the credit card industry is the most profitable arm of the banking industry. Okay, there's a reason they're the most profitable arm of the banking industry, and that is because they know they have their pit bull debt collectors out there that are going to call and they're going to collect on all those fees and penalties, and you're paying 35% interest, and you get a penalty for this, and you get a penalty for paying your garbage bill late, you get a penalty for paying your cable bill late, and these contracts are written by teams of Harvard MBAs, and they know how to show you the money, and that's what they do. And the banking industry would never get those phantom fees, those they're fees that they would never collect but for the debt collector. So you can go to the next slide. Just pointing out there that there is no such thing as a hyper technical violation of this law. That's what debt collectors like to say. Well, okay, we called 15 minutes before 8 a.m. We got our clock mixed up. We were calling from India or Israel or Canada, because that's where a lot of these jobs are going. Now these jobs are getting outsourced all over the place. And, they can say, it was a mistake. But it's not, yeah, it's not so much of it being a mistake. You either comply and obey with the law, or you violate it. And if you're found to have violated it, the debt collector has to pay. Yes, ma'am.
The wrong number, they do call, they wake us up, we get up at 7:30. They call before 8 o'clock. Sometimes they call after 8 or 9 or later. And I answer the phone, they say, well, we're on Mountain Pacific time.
Right.
They told me the day one. So we're actually 2 hours behind.
Are they calling on a landline or a cell phone?
It's a landline.
Okay. You know, you can get the telephone records. They're not the easiest things to get, but you know, we can get them as a lawyer by issuing a subpoena, and a lot of times those records will show what time those calls came in. I want to just say something about cell phones, because debt collectors are not typically allowed to call and collect on a debt. They're not allowed to call a consumer's cell phone, and there is an exception. If the consumer gave out his cell phone when they made the purchase, in other words, when they asked for that credit card, if they filled out the application, if they put down their cell phone number, then the collector can call the cell phone number. But in many, many, many cases, consumers have only put down their home telephone number. Maybe they didn't have that cell phone when they, you know, applied for this line of credit. But the debt collector has found that cell phone number out. And if they start calling that cell phone number, there's a law called the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which every time a debt collector calls that cell phone, it awards damages of $500 per call. So I always, you know, I'm always very happy to hear from clients, you know, that have been getting called on their cell phone, and they didn't give any permission, they didn't give express permission to be called on by their cell phone. And the rationale is, you know, that uses up minutes. I had a client, I mean, they used to just call the cell phone and they wouldn't even say anything. They just let the minutes run.